Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, Rules for Risk, a model for managing operational risks. I'm Angela Herron, editor for Special Projects and Research at HBR, and I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I want to thank Zurich for making this discussion possible. We really want this to be an interactive discussion, so if you have a question at any time, click the icon in the lower right-hand corner and send in your comments. We'll get to as many as we can during the presentation. We'll also have a conversation going on Twitter. Find us at HBR Exchange and use the hashtag HBRWebinar. Operational risks exist in every endeavor and in all our organizations. These include risks like damage to physical assets, business disruption and system failure, data theft, and fraud. Despite knowing how important operational risks are, however, most companies are still struggling with the best ways to identify and manage their operational risks. Organizations of all sizes and in all industries continue to seek out the best practices for identifying and managing key operational risks, as well as looking for the governance structure to embed those best practices across their organizations. So how do companies put in place effective practices for identifying and managing risk? With us today is Philippa Gerling to dissect the management of operational risk and provide case studies of organizations that have managed these risks effectively. Philippa has 18 years' experience in the global securities industry, working in the fields of operational risk, training, project management, and organizational change. She has held several key operational risk leadership roles, including heading the global corporate operational risk functions at Morgan Stanley and Nomura. She has delivered the Operational Risk Executive Education Program at Columbia for the past 4 years, as well as led the Operational Risk Education sessions for London Business School. She's co-authored a textbook, Operational Risk and Management, and she was recently selected as one of the top 50 faces of operational risk by Operational Risk and Compliance magazine. Philippa, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, I know that in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, risk is on all of our minds. There's a lot of discussion about what should we or could we have done differently. I recently had an executive tell me, well, you know, discussions of risk always look so smart when you're looking at the event in the rearview mirror. But could we have done things differently, and can we do a better job of managing such risks?
Well, I think that's the important question with operational risk. Certainly, we look at Sandy and some lessons are learned. I know the lesson I learned is fill up your car with gas before there's a hurricane. And my daughter, who lives in New Orleans, tells me everyone in New Orleans already knows that. So certainly there are some things we could have learned from people who've been through hurricanes before. Having said that, there was a lot of good preparation for Hurricane Sandy. And certainly most of what we do in operational risk management is not look back, but look forward. So what I'm going to do today is really talk about how you can think about operational risk from all perspectives. What can you learn from what just happened? What should you know about where you are right now? And how can you think about the future? And with that, I'd like to start and go into a definition of operational risk, if that's okay, Angela?
Yes, it'd be great.
Okay. All right, so if we move on to the first slide, the most important thing we need to establish at the beginning here is what do we mean? So when we talk about operational risk, what are we talking about? Now, about 10 years ago, it was a fairly simple definition. When people were talking about operational risk, they simply meant if it isn't market risk and if it isn't credit risk, then it's operational risk. So it was a big catch-all definition. Since then, we've had some regulations come in, global regulations, and those regulations have really driven us towards a much more refined definition. And the definition that you see on this slide actually comes from the Basel II regulations. Now, some of you will be painfully aware of those regulations. Some of you will not find that they apply to you. But the definition, nevertheless, will. Because what we've found in the last few years is that every regulator, every rating agency, and most firms are taking this definition as the definition of operational risk. So the definition is, if there's a risk of loss that results from failed or inadequate people, systems, processes, or external events, then you're facing operational risk. Now, it's not a beautiful sentence. The grammar is a little poor. It's a sentence by committee. But nevertheless, the meaning is clear. What we're saying here is if something goes wrong with your people, your systems, your processes, or you have an external event, and this leads to the risk of loss, then you're facing operational risk. Now, two slight refinements on this definition are that the original regulatory definition is specific about including legal risk. So they're being very clear that we also mean every type of legal risk. And they were also clear in saying it excludes reputational risk. Now, even though this regulatory definition excludes reputational risk, you will find that all operational risk departments do consider reputational impact. And if we look today at some of the case studies of what's gone on in the operational risk space, we know that the reputational impact is sometimes even larger than the financial impact. So let's take a look at today. Hurricane Sandy is a very good example of all of the different elements of an operational risk event. Many different organizations were hit by this operational risk event, as well as the individuals who lived in the areas that were hit by it. So let's think about some of those. First of all, power. The loss of power is an operational risk event. Connectivity. Anyone who could no longer access their networks, this was an operational risk event. The loss of phones. Any type of communication loss, that's an operational risk event. The actual physical damage to buildings and roads and factories and sewage plants, all of that was part of an operational risk event. The New York Stock Exchange making a decision to shut down, that was an operational risk event. The life safety issues and the loss of life were all operational risk events. And finally, of course, all of the work done around business continuity and disaster recovery are all aspects of operational risk. So the Hurricane Sandy event really touched on many aspects of operational risk. And later in this presentation, we're going to talk about the categories of impact and the categories of events. And you'll realize at that time that most impact categories and most event categories were in fact present in the Hurricane Sandy operational risk event. My personal story on Hurricane Sandy is we had no power or heat for 8 days, and we learned what it was to live by candlelight. And as I said before, the lesson I learned is fill up my car with gas, the other things we'd thought about. Okay, but what about other types of operational risk events today? Apart from natural disasters, external events, there are things that go wrong within the industry. So some examples of that have happened really just in the last few months. Let's think about Knight Capital. And I saw from headlines today that Knight Capital continue to suffer from the original event that they had in the summer. They had some sort of technology glitch. We know a little bit about it. They rolled some software out in the morning. It meant that they ended up trading in areas they did not intend to trade in high frequency. And before they could turn off the systems that were pursuing these trades, they had realized a loss of $400 million. Now, this was a process failure. When we think of people, process, systems, and external events, there may well have been a people failure. Maybe someone made a mistake. And the loss to Knight Capital was profound. And in fact, they were very fortunate that they were so highly considered in the industry that many people stepped forward to help rescue them. And they, in fact, were able to find benefactors to help them make it through that week and now continue on as a viable business. However, you can be sure that they're looking at what lessons can be learned. And I think one of the important lessons for them is probably not so much from the individual event itself, but from the fact that they needed to have a robust operational risk framework. And it's that missing framework which is causing concerns, it seems, in the press today with the SEC, who are continuing to ask questions about how this happened, but also why it was they didn't have a framework to ensure that it didn't happen. Okay, let's think of another event that happened fairly recently, the UBS rogue trader, Kweku Adebole. So here we had unauthorized trading going on in one particular area of UBS. The resulting losses to UBS were over $2 billion. Now, some of the activities that were being pursued by Kweku Adebole were strikingly similar to what happened with Societe Generale just a few years ago with Jerome Cuvier. He also was engaged in unauthorized trading, also on the Delta One desk, also was supposed to be responsible for many small transactions. Some of the control failings actually seem to be similar. Now, the interesting thing with this particular event to me is that there was a lesson that was learned some years ago when Societe Generale lost over $7 billion from unauthorized trading, and yet this happened again with UBS. And you can be sure that every financial institution in the wake of UBS went back to their Societe Generale lessons learned and checked to see if they ever had, in fact, implemented all of those proposals that they had made at the time. And I think many firms found that as people became less excited about the topic, the interest waned and some of the controls were allowed to weaken. And so even though you can learn from the past, you certainly need to always be keeping your finger on the pulse and making sure that you're prepared for what could happen in the future. Okay, then what about the king of Wall Street? So J.P. Morgan, who have long-term been considered as pioneers in operational risk management, actually, and also really at the forefront of good risk management, they had a very embarrassing event where their whale, as he was called, Bruno Ixil, was found to be leading a trading strategy that was considered to be inappropriate by many at the time and led to a $2 billion loss for their firm. Now, as I mentioned earlier, although we are looking at financial losses here, in all of these cases, the reputational impact was high. And obviously, in an operational risk framework that's successful, you think not just about the financial impacts, but you also think about the reputational impacts. And speaking of reputational impacts, the current interest in bringing anti-money laundering fines against banks, such as Standard Chartered, and several others are being pursued. These are the types of operational risk events that really carry a high reputational impact. Because anything where the man in the street can look at something and think it sounds suspect does not bode well for the organization. So things like anti-money laundering fines or foreign corrupt practices fines to do with bribery abroad, these are particularly embarrassing operational risk events. So these are the types of things that have been going on in the industry, and every single week you will find it easy to identify something in your paper that is an operational risk event. In one of the classes that I teach on operational risk, I always bring in a stack of newspapers, today's newspapers, at the beginning of the class, and I ask the participants to identify 5 big operational risk events, and they have no trouble finding those 5. The flavor of those events tends to depend on where I am in an organization, and whether we're actually in a European or Russia was an interesting place to pursue this. But you'll see, although the flavor is different, quite often there's going to be at least 5 major events. Now, one of the things that we need to think about are the different operational risk categories that can be applied. Now, operational risk has lots of flavors. We've talked about a few keen examples there. But what I'd like to do now is walk through the 7 categories that are available. So on the left we see internal fraud and external fraud. You see employment practice and workplace safety. You'll see that those categories, internal and external fraud, are going to be closely linked, and we'll talk about that. Clients, products, and business practices, damage to physical assets, business disruption and system failures, and execution, delivery, and process management. Now, the interesting thing with these 7 categories is that these are categories that were developed by the regulators, and I have found them to be surprisingly robust. I've been working with these 7 categories since they first came out in around 2004, and to my surprise, I have yet to find an operational risk event that we could not fit into one of these categories. Even when we took operational risk outside of financial services and applied it to a commodities firm, as an example, I was working with a commodities firm who were freighting grain from Ukraine to Russia, and we were looking at operational risk for them, and we found that these categories still worked. They needed to refine slightly what they meant by damage to physical assets, and they needed to refine slightly what they meant about execution, delivery, and process management, but nevertheless, these 7 categories do seem to work. So one of the things you're going to do at the beginning of an operational risk framework is think about what are the categories that you're going to have to manage. Okay, let's start with internal fraud. So internal fraud is where you're going to have a loss due to bad behavior by somebody within your organization. Now, within an organization, the risk of fraud is always high. If you are an organization where you've had very few fraud events, you always need to ask yourself, is that because we're a great organization or because we're really bad at finding fraud? And it could be either. So are you aware of the fraud that's going on in the organization? Do you have the right framework in place to identify, assess, control, and mitigate that type of event? And then secondly, external fraud. So external fraud is where someone is committing fraud from the outside. So there's nobody involved on the inside. It's more like straight theft. Somebody's coming in and stealing secrets about your organization. Now, the management of internal fraud and external fraud is often hand in hand. Often you'll have somebody whose responsibility it is to manage those particular impacts. And you may have decided that that's something that you have a separate entity to deal with, or you may decide that your operational risk people are going to manage it. But it's one of those areas of a firm that needs active and proactive management. Okay, what about employment practices and workplace safety? Now, this is a category where a lot of the embarrassing events occur. Okay, in this category, you have class action lawsuits because there's been discriminatory behavior, for example, or unfair pay policies, or any type of inappropriate activity by management, for example, any harassment. Also, if somebody slips and falls, that could also come within this category. So employment practice and workplace safety is usually rife with HR issues and requires really strong participation from your human resources department. Clients, products, and business practices. Now, this is a category which in the financial services industry has the big events. Clients, products, and business practices tend to be events where there has been some kind of unintentional or negligent failure to meet some obligation to a client. So, for example, you've got a poorly designed product, or there's been mis-selling of a product. Someone selling complex derivatives to grandmothers in Omaha could result in a class action lawsuit in this category, clients, products, and business practices. They don't tend to be the most number of events in this category, but the most expensive tend to be in that category. The highest number of events are in the execution, delivery, and process management category. The execution, delivery, and process management category is where something goes wrong from the beginning to the end of the intended transaction. We meant to buy or sell over here, and then it needs to go all the way through our books and end up on our financials at the end of the process. Something goes wrong along that process, either internally or possibly with third-party vendors. Most events tend to be in the execution, delivery, and process management category. Lots of small events tend to sit in this category, and it requires a different type of management to the client's products and business practices category. And you'll find that your operations department, for example, is really good at managing these types of events, the execution, delivery, and process management events. And then there's business disruption and system failure. Business disruption and system failure is what we saw so much of with Hurricane Sandy. Okay, there was a lot of disruption to the businesses, and firms that were well prepared quickly moved their employees to new work sites, quickly moved all of their systems onto the backups, and were able to recommence their work. Those that were not that well prepared or had not properly tested the backup systems suffered more at this point. So good preparation for business disruption and system failure is very important, and a lot of events occur in this area. Sometimes the cost of events in this area is really hard to find. You just know that you can't do business. And then finally, of course, damage to physical assets, and this is actual losses to buildings or assets, usually from natural disaster or possibly something like terrorist attack. So certainly 9/11 was an example of a large damage to physical assets event, and Hurricane Sandy was too. So I'm going to pause at that point and check in with Angela and see if we're moving at the right pace, where things stand with any questions that may have come up.
Where would you put vendor failure in these categories? Because a lot of people say, well, you know, my business is dependent on vendors, and I don't have any insight into exactly what they're doing, and there can be all kinds of failure with them.
Yes, that's very true. And sometimes, by the way, people will pull out a separate category of supplier or third-party vendor. It's really a subset of execution, delivery, and process management.
Okay.
The important thing to remember with third parties and vendors is you may not own the controls anymore, but you still own the risk. And the regulators, if you have a regulator who's coming in to look at you, they will be very keen to know, how are you monitoring your suppliers and your third-party vendors to ensure that they are maintaining control standards that are appropriate? Because if they mess up, you pay the price. You can't just say, well, I handed it off to this expert firm and they messed it up. The regulator is going to say, well, how were you tracking that that expert firm was actually meeting its goals? So you should have a very robust service level agreement with them. You should have very robust metrics and reporting that you use to ensure that they are on track with their deliverables and are really maintaining the quality of controls that you want to have.
Great. Okay, let's proceed.
So the challenge with operational risk is that it's the same and it's different. Okay, so remembering the definition, we're looking at the risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people, and systems or external events. So it's the same as other risk types in that this is a risk that needs to be managed. So there should be a rigor applied to that risk management in the same way that you have a rigor applied to your market risk management, your credit risk management, possibly your liquidity risk management. And if you don't manage that risk, then you can end up with a very large loss due to an operational risk event occurring. Okay, so it's similar to market and credit risk in those ways. On the other hand, it's really different to market and credit risk because market and credit risk you take with a purpose. So, for example, a firm can decide, let's move into this particular market, this product or this country or this geography or this client group. And as you make that decision to move in to a particular area, you look at, well, what is the market risk exposure we will be exposed to if we do that? And what is the credit risk exposure of us engaging with this particular population of clients, for example. However, operational risk, you don't take by decision. You have it inherently in your organization. As soon as you have one employee, one computer, one office, or one desk or one chair, you have operational risk. Because the very process of running a business is fraught with operational risk. It exists in the natural course of your corporate activity. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't make decisions about that risk, that you can identify and lower that risk, but it means you can never escape it. You can't decide, let's just not take on any operational risk. It would mean having no people, no products, no business. So operational risk is different, and some of those differences mean that you have to approach it in a different way. There is a lot of qualitative aspect to operational risk management. You need to be able to work comfortably in areas where the numbers aren't really solidly telling you about your risk profile. There is a lot more that you have to understand around a subjective view of your risk, and you have to become comfortable with awkward definitions such as high, medium, and low risk. And you need to think very clearly about your risk appetite. And how are you going to articulate risk appetite in something as tenuous to define as operational risk? So those are the risk categories that you're working with, but you're also working with not just risk event types, but impact types. So I'm going to skim back to slide 11. And I want you to think about the fact that with operational risk, unlike market and credit risk, you're dealing not only with financial impact, but you're also dealing with client, regulatory, life safety, and reputational impact. Now, some of these do come up with market and credit risk, but they all frequently come up with operational risk. Let's think about financial impact. You can have a loss. Let's say, for example, you are sued in a class action lawsuit by those grandmothers in Omaha because you sold them complex derivatives that they didn't want and shouldn't have been sold. So there's a class action lawsuit. It results in, let's say, a $100 million loss. That is a direct financial impact. Now, an indirect financial impact might be all the legal fees you paid in the process of losing that $100 million. So those indirect losses are also important to you as you size the risk that you faced. And then there's the reputational aspect. Okay, selling complex derivatives to grandmothers in Omaha really is not something that does much for your reputation, so there's a reputational hit. And a reputational hit can result in share value decline. And there have been quite a lot of research into this that shows that share value decline from reputational impact is quite sticky, more sticky than an operational risk event that doesn't have any negative reputational aspects to it. And then there's the client impact. You're going to have lost probably all those grandmothers in Omaha, so that's a whole client section where there's been an impact to you. You're not sure what the financial cost is. It may be an opportunity loss. It may be that future clients are not coming to you because they've heard about this event. Then there's the regulatory and legal impact, perhaps. The regulators are going to come in now and fine you for your behavior. In this particular example, there isn't a life safety aspect, but sometimes there is in an operational risk event. So operational risk is managing 7 event categories of risk and 5 different impact categories of risk. All right, so We have our 7 risk categories. We have our 5 impact categories. What is it we're trying to do? Now, in operational risk, you are trying to get a handle on what went wrong. The question Angela started with is, okay, we know now, looking at Hurricane Sandy or looking in the rearview mirror, what we probably should have done differently. How do we actually think about the future? Well, there are 4 things that we're asked to do in operational risk management, and your operational risk framework should be designed to address these 4 main things, and then this one additional 5th one some of you have to think about. First one is identification. Can you find the risk? So you need tools that help you identify where does operational risk exist. And then you need tools that assess the size of that risk. Once you've identified and assessed the size of a risk, you need to work out how you're going to watch it, how you're going to control and monitor that risk so you know if it's increasing or if it's decreasing. And then finally, if you've decided that this risk is unacceptable, how are you going to mitigate it? So those are the 4 main tenets of operational risk. Can you identify it, assess it, control it, and mitigate it? And then for some of you, you also have to hold capital, which means that the regulators have required you to set aside certain sums of money to ensure that if a major operational risk event occurs, you as a firm are protected with a pool of capital so that you can pay for that event. So those are the main aspects of operational risk. So then if we take a look at something outside the financial services area, let's take a look at the Olympics. So the recent Summer Olympics, of which I am very proud, of course, being British, excellent event, those Olympics were fraught with operational risk. All 7 categories that we've discussed were present in just the headlines that you saw, and these are all headlines taken from the press at the time. So in internal fraud, there were concerns about the badminton players purposely throwing games. In external fraud, there were concerns about fake tickets being sold. In the client's products and business practices area, there were vast areas of empty seats at one point, which prompted investigations. In the employment practice and workplace safety area, there were some disputes between the Musicians Union and the Olympic Committee. In the execution, delivery, and process management area, there were calls that the ticket distribution of the actual tickets, not the fake tickets, was a mess. In the damage to physical assets, the security shortfall was something that was a real concern. And the reason that was a concern in this category is the possibility of terrorist attack and that there could be some damage to the facilities. And then finally, in the business disruption area, there was a lot of press about the traffic jams and the special Olympic Games lanes. So all of these were categories of risk that Sebastian Coe and his committee were trying to manage. What was fascinating to me when I looked at the Olympics as a case study for operational risk was I took a look at the documents that they produced in their annual report on how they were going to manage this risk. And lo and behold, they used exactly the same language that we use in financial services, that they needed to identify, assess, and control the risk. And there's a quote here from the annual report. Management uses a common model to identify and assess the impact of risks to their business. For each risk, the likelihood and consequence are identified, management controls, and the frequency of monitoring are confirmed, and results reported. Now, I'll admit the word mitigation doesn't actually appear right there, but everything else in that document is about how they're going to mitigate those risks. So the operational risk framework that was originally developed by Basel II to help financial services manage their operational risk has proved to be remarkably applicable outside financial services, and I've certainly seen it applied outside financial services with really some success. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do now is really talk to you about what are the elements of an operational risk framework. And I'm going to touch on each of them. I won't be able to go into them in depth, but we'll be able to talk about some of the main things you need to think about when you're putting together an operational risk framework. But just before I do that, I'm going to pause and check, Angela, we're on track, or any questions you'd like me to address at the moment?
We are on track, and just one quick question where someone asked if you could talk a little bit about the link between reputational risk and the rise in cyber attacks. I think the questioner is trying to get to the point that that cyber risk is becoming a huge risk to reputation. The two are incredibly entwined, particularly if you're a customer-facing organization, a retail organization, or actually anyone who holds anyone's financial information.
Right. Well, I think actually that probably the most critical risk to be managing at the moment is cyber attack. And the reason I say that is because it's been clear for the last 6 months that the government started dropping hints in the press that we should be thinking about this seriously, and in the end they got tired of dropping hints and they just became completely overt about it and said, seriously, we're under attack, you're all under attack, make sure you're ready. And since they've made that announcement, we've seen significant outages occur on a schedule. So we've had an announcement will go out saying, I'm going to bring down this bank's ATMs at this time, and they successfully do it. So we know that the hacktivists, or in a more sinister way, some of the terrorist cyber attack is really very sophisticated at this point. And I think you're right that there's reputational impact. I don't know that that's the number one concern, because at this point, so many people have been successfully attacked that there's no safety in numbers. If you can point to 25 other banks that have had that issue, it's less embarrassing than if you're the only one.
Good point.
So if you look at Knight Capital, for example, if everybody had trouble with the New York Stock Exchange that morning, there wouldn't have been a reputational impact for them to the same extent that there was. But on the other hand, the significance of the financial losses that could come from a successful cyber attack cannot be overstated. And this is certainly something I've been looking into with colleagues as well, as we start to look at how do you put in place a really robust technology risk management program so that you are sure you're at least doing everything you can.
Great. So let's get into the operational risk framework.
Okay. So let's think about the elements that make up a good operational risk framework. So first and fundamentally, you have to have good governance. So you cannot create an operational risk framework in a vacuum. You need to know who owns operational risk management and what does operational risk management own. So who does your operational risk function report up to? Do they report up to your chief risk officer? If you have one, that's a good idea. And it's sort of the expectation now from the regulators. The advantage of reporting to your chief risk officer is that you have an opportunity to demonstrate you're important, you're relevant, you're independent, because the risk function is seen that way. It also means that you're at the table for the right risk committee conversations, that there's authority in that role. The advantage of instead reporting into something like the chief operating officer is that that gives you an opportunity to really partner with compatible functions like business continuity and information security and compliance and legal and all those functions where they're used to managing operational risk on a daily basis. But it certainly needs to be clear. Who owns operational risk and what does operational risk own? Operational risk could own the business continuity function. They could own the SOX program if you have one. They could own the information security program. They could own the new product approval program. There are all sorts of things that can be owned by operational risk. If they're not owned by operational risk, they certainly will be partnering very closely, and that should all be well articulated in your policies, which outline your governance. You need to be able to show that you can escalate a risk appropriately from somewhere in the firm up to the appropriate senior manager to ensure that it is addressed. Okay, so once you've decided on what the governance structure is going to be and all the right sponsors and ownership is in place, you need to start working on culture and awareness. Now, if time is not spent educating the organization on what operational risk is and why they need to care, then anything else that you do to manage that risk is sort of lost work. You need to make sure that you put time and effort into ensuring that people are educated, and you go through the whole marketing and branding program that makes people care about operational risk. And there are certainly enough catastrophic events in the press right now to help really sell that message. And then with your governance decisions in place and your culture and awareness under your belt, you need to build everything else on a good systems of policies and procedures. Now, there used to be a time where we didn't really care that much about policy and procedure, certainly in financial services. When we did it, there was more of a nod. Now it's an absolute art and science. Your policies should be consistent. They should be something that can be measured against. the audit department should be holding people accountable for whether they're living up to policies and procedures. So you do need policies and procedures in your operational risk framework. But what is the work that you're actually going to do? Okay, there are 4 main pieces of work that are going to get done in a good operational risk program. Firstly, you're going to learn from and gather loss data. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see internal loss data and external loss data. Internal loss data, bad things that have happened to you. Much more popular is external loss data, bad things that have happened to other people. You want both of those as part of your framework. In the internal loss data space is going to be a whole program where you require people to report an operational risk event where there's a loss over a certain dollar threshold. And you will decide what that threshold is. If you have a regulator who cares about it, they're going to help you decide what that threshold should be. But a lot of firms pick something like $10,000, or in an area like operations, they may decide they want to collect everything and just have a threshold of 0. So you decide. Every time an operational risk event that meets our definition happens, we need to record it somewhere in a loss database. That loss database these days tends to be something web-based. They're getting more and more sophisticated. You usually capture the size of the event, the risk category. Is it internal fraud, clients, products, business practices, etc.? The business line, which is impacted by the event, and where it happened and how, including a description. Once you've caught the details around that event and all of the associated dates around that event, then you can also think about, and how shall we mitigate this risk so it does not occur in future? And that's really where the benefit comes from in your loss data program. What can you learn from this thing that happened? Similarly, you're going to want to learn from bad things that happen to other people. So your external loss data, you can either be a member in some sort of consortium of data. There's a consortium in the banking industry, for example, called ORX, where all the banks put their loss data into one big pool. It's anonymized. Then they are given back a benchmark of how their data looks as against the whole pool. That's useful for them, so they can see whether they're trending in the same way as the industry. And then there are things like AlgoFirst, which is an external loss database where they will trawl through all of the newspaper articles and regulatory filings and look for events that happen. I, at the moment, have a Twitter where I each day look through the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the Financial Times, various other sources to see if there's a hot operational risk event worth talking about and Twitter it out. So there are lots of ways that you can get external loss data information. And the question that you're going to be asked by your senior management team is going to be, can this happen here? And you're going to want to be able to answer if it can happen here, and if it can, what you're doing to prevent it, or if it can't happen here, why are you confident that it can't happen here? So all of the events we talked about earlier, Knight Capital, JP Morgan Whale, UBS Trader, Standard Chartered, Hurricane Sandy, all of those are events where people are asking themselves right now, could we have done something differently? Could this happen to us? How are we sure we're prepared? So that's the loss data program, looking behind you. What's already happened to me or to others that I can learn from. Now, if you're going to really identify, assess, control, and mitigate risk, you also need to look forward. So to look forward, you have these other 3 elements of your program. Risk and control self-assessment, which we call RCSA, or sometimes RCSA, scenario analysis, and key risk indicators. So let's start with risk and control self-assessment. Risk and control self-assessment is some program that you have within your organization where each corner of the firm looks at its own risk profile and identifies, I know what happened to me before, but what could happen to me now? So what are the risks that I face in my business line or my functional area today? What controls do I have that help mitigate that risk? How well are those controls working? Is there anything I need to do differently to make them more effective and to mitigate this risk further? That's the Risk and Control Self-Assessment Program. It's an area that across the industry people have been struggling with mastering. There's good, bad, and indifferent practices in this space, but everybody's moving forward and maturing their risk and control self-assessment programs, and there's certainly some best practices you can take advantage of now. Really complementary to risk and control self-assessment is scenario analysis. Now, scenario analysis is more about what is the worst that can happen. Okay, if the sky fell, what would it look like for this firm? Scenario analysis is not so much about expected losses, things that you know you need to mitigate, but really what is our worst case scenario? If we had internal fraud happen, how many things would have to go wrong at the same time for it to really be a $2 billion event? So scenario analysis is a very important part of your framework because it gives you the opportunity to have conversations with the front office and the business lines about hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of operational risk and decisions that might need to be made as a result of that. And then finally, key risk indicators, although really I prefer to call this metrics. And this would be what can you measure that will help you know if your risk is going up or down. Now, most people have found ways to measure control effectiveness or control performance. It's very difficult to measure risk. Nevertheless, it's worth trying, and a lot of people are working on how to refine their metrics programs so that they get to something that really looks like a key risk indicator. Now, all of this needs to feed into what you do with it. It's all very well doing that work, but having that data does not address risk management. Having that data just gives you the tools for good risk management. So you need to feed that information into any measurement and modeling you have to do. If you're calculating capital, for example, you're going to look at those inputs and use them in your capital. And then you need to produce reports that people can action. What is it that you know about operational risk right now that requires somebody to make a decision? Or what can you share with them about their risk that they did not know? Give them some transparency into their risk. And then really, once you've been through the process of putting a framework in place, you can start to think about risk appetite. Risk appetite is a really hard conversation. And I always recommend to people that they leave it till the end. Because when you start to talk to people about how much operational risk do you want, they're going to say, don't make stupid mistakes. But that's not something that's easy to measure. So risk appetite is usually something I would leave until you really have a good framework in place. So the analogy I like to use for a good operational risk framework is it's a bit like driving a car. Right? If you learn to drive a car, it is your skills as a driver that keeps you safe on the road. However, you would be foolish to drive without a dashboard. You're going to want a dashboard where you can see how fast am I going? Does my oil need changing? When am I due for a service? That sort of information are the metrics that you can gather. And you can gather those metrics through your loss data program, your risk and control self-assessment program, even your scenario analysis program. And that helps you to be a better driver. But you have to keep your eyes on the road, and none of that tells you you're about to get hit by a truck. Okay, so that truck is the unexpected catastrophic event, which is why the regulators ask you to hold capital. Because even if you're a great driver, and even if you have a great car, and even if your dashboard is working perfectly, you can still have an unexpected catastrophic event, and that's why they ask you to hold capital. However, you should be doing everything you can to ensure you're in the safest possible environment as far as operational risk is concerned. Now, the slides that follow on from here you have in your deck and really talk about what I discussed in the overview there. And I'm going to skip straight through them. And I'm just going to touch on reporting and enterprise risk management.
It's a great point, Pippa, because actually we have people who are asking this very question about who owns operational risk function, where should it report?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's think about that. If you think about enterprise risk management, not many firms truly have an enterprise risk management model at the moment, to be fair, but they have something like it. If your operational risk manager reports into the chief risk officer, then you have an opportunity to pursue an enterprise risk management approach. And this slide really just talks about where do these risks fit. So if you have on the outside edges of this wheel, market risk, credit risk, strategic risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk, these are all risks that get managed throughout the organization. Now, if a geopolitical risk event occurs, you'll see that's an inner circle. And the reason I've put that inside is you could have something happen in the geopolitical risk frame that impacts all of the outer edges of the wheel. So, for example, let's say China decides to make it illegal to trade a particular type of derivative. If they made that law overnight, you're going to be facing all of these risks at once. You have a market risk event because something that you owned might now be worth nothing. You have a credit risk event because perhaps your counterparties are really in that particular product and are now going to become insolvent. Perhaps you have strategic and liquidity risk issues based on your business model in that area. Then you have operational risk because what you're doing is illegal. Okay, so geopolitical risk impacts everywhere outside the circle. In the same way, everything on the outside of the circle can cause reputational risk. You can have a market risk event that causes reputational risk. You can have an operational risk event that causes reputational risk. In effect, what they're really doing is causing reputational impact. Now, if you want to be able to manage all of your risks holistically, you need to have all of those risk functions reporting into the Chief Risk Officer. However, if you're in an organization that doesn't have that function of Chief Risk Officer, you can have your operational risk function report into a COO, Chief Operating Officer. CFO is a little tricky because you want to make sure that you're managing the risks in the finance department as well. But somebody on the senior level and the executive level is who you need to manage operational risk. And their sphere of influence will be important in your success, because if they're able to influence compliance and SOX and business continuity and information security, then you're in a better position than if you're reporting into one corner of the organization where that sphere of influence isn't really there. So I'm going to finish up there. I'm going to leave you with the operational risk framework so that we have time to answer some questions, because I know that we wanted to hold some time for that.
Great. So a couple people are asking if you can talk a little more about culture and awareness and maybe what sort of policies and procedures you put into place so that you really embed this in the organization.
Right. There's a few things that you can do, top-down and bottom-up. From the top-down approach, I've always spent many months ensuring that the senior management team are on my side for operational risk, which means going to meet with them, educating them on what operational risk is and why they need to care about it. One, because they have to, often, because it's a regulatory requirement. And two, because they should, because they're bleeding money as an organization through poor operational risk management. And so you're looking at ways to help them improve their bottom line and meet their regulatory requirements and have transparency about how their risk is managed. So top down, you need to invest the time and energy in those high-level conversations. Bottom up, I am a strong advocate for everybody in your organization should be trained on operational risk, which means that you should have some online module, takes 10 minutes, that says you are an operational risk manager because you work at this firm. This is what operational risk looks like. When you see it, this is what we need you to do. And it can be something very simple. We need you to contact your operational risk manager, or maybe if you're a smaller firm, we want you to enter it into the loss database, and this is how. So you need to make sure that the education is happening top-down and bottom-up. From a policies and procedures point of view, there are lots of good practices out there on what a good operational risk policy should look like. And when it comes to writing procedures, you need to make sure that those procedures are not overly burdensome, but are not too vague. So you need to walk that nice fine line between clarity and appropriateness.
So let me follow up on that, because someone else asked about when you're talking about procedures, can you talk a little bit about metrics and metric procedures?
One of the things I found helpful with metrics procedures is to offer a standard template. So these are the sorts of things you should know about your metrics. And so, for example, it would be who owns it, what system is it in, what is the unit of measure that it's captured in, what data quality checks do you have, how often is it captured, what does it relate to, like what risk, what control, and where in your taxonomy that you should have within the firm does this metric fit. The use of metrics is really going to depend. I mean, metrics are useful across your organization. Everybody's going to use them, but some of them will be more useful for operational risk management than others. So rather than dictating how you use them, what you can do with your procedures is ensure that there's high standards around how they're captured and that they're consistent and they're high quality.
We have a number of questions about the appetite for risk. Here's one variation. How does a good organization ensure that they've got a really consistent understanding of their organization's risk tolerance by the decision makers, particularly throughout the organization?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, actually, because if you have a scale, let's say you decide on a financial scale for risk. So if there's a risk that could realize and it would be over $100,000, we care about it. Or in a large organization, it's more going to be, if it's over $1 million, we care about it. Well, that's not enough information, because how frequently can that event occur? If you're going to lose $1 million every day, you're going to care more about it than if there's a possibility of losing $1 million in the next 10 years. So first of all, when you score risks, it needs to be a combination of both likely impact and likely frequency. It's only those two things together that give you something comparable to other risks. So most people score their risks in some way, size and frequency. And then the question is, all right, so then we as an organization, what are we comfortable with? What is the risk that's beyond our tolerance? And the reason I said is it's quite good to talk about risk appetite at the end is because people need to live an operational risk framework for a while before they really understand what their own appetite is. If, for example, you have a high, medium, low type scoring for risks, and you define high as over $1 million happening within the next year, then quite quickly, working within that organization, you'll get a sense for whether people are comfortable with that being the high risk. And that comfortable level is something that you have to then become, it has to be possible to articulate. And it is very difficult to do. And a lot of firms are struggling with it right now, because when you start talking to senior management, they don't know what their risk appetite is. And you have to present them with alternatives. Something I've seen to be quite successful was getting away from the financial impact and instead attaching thresholds to metrics. So, for example, if you have a policy regarding new product approval, you could have a metric that says, if we see more than 5 products in one quarter that are issued without proper approval, we consider that to be beyond our risk appetite, and it will be escalated. It's very qualitative.
As a follow-on to that, and perhaps this is a very philosophical question, someone says, how do you address the conflict between risk management and higher returns? In other words, how can a CEO justify lower returns at the expense of sound risk management, which only looks good when bad things happen?
Right. Well, see, that's the heart of it, really. I think to address that tension, the role of the operational risk function should be to provide transparency into the risk. It's not that you're asking senior management to mitigate all the risk. It's that you are telling them what the risk is so that they can then make a decision as to whether they think it's appropriate to move forward. If this is the risk I'm facing, am I still comfortable that it's worth pursuing this particular strategy? And often the answer will be yes, by the way. Yes, I'm aware that that's the risk now that you've told me, and yes, we're going to move forward. The cardinal sin for an operational risk manager is if they don't tell them what the risk is that they're facing, and they move forward, and then they're going to come back to you later and say, why didn't you warn me that that could happen? So our job a lot of the time is to ensure that there is transparency of risk, not so much that there's mitigation of risk.
You mentioned capital modeling at least a little earlier in the conversation. Could you talk a little bit more about what you think are the components or the elements ought to be in your capital model and how you think about it?
Yes, I'm going to go back through the slides a little because I have a slide on that.
Oh, great.
Okay, so here it is. For Basel II, when the Basel II regulations came out, which were for global financial services firms, there were 3 ways that you could model your capital for operational risk. The first 2 ways were fairly simple. You just took an average revenue for the last 3 years, and then you multiply it by a particular multiplier, and that gave you your operational risk capital. Most firms now are facing the daunting task of coming up with what's called an advanced measurement approach, or an AMA approach. An AMA approach requires you to build a model that is truly risk sensitive. And that model must have these 4 elements. It must include your internal loss data, so your own risk profile of history, external loss data, what's happened in the industry, scenario analysis, what is the rare catastrophic event, and then these things called business environment internal control factors, which people equate to outputs from risk and control self-assessments or metrics. Now, in reality, the regulators in the States are more comfortable with loss data than with anything else. They like to see internal loss data. Well, you have to have internal loss data, but they also want to see it somehow adjusted for external losses. So just because it didn't happen to you, you should have learned from the fact that it happened in the industry. Find a way to include relevant loss data in your set of data. And then scenario analysis and business environment internal control factors, they're a little uncomfortable with. And they like to see those used in other ways, possibly to stress test your model or to help you with allocating your capital. I mean, a perfect AMA model would have all of these four elements, but a lot of people are pursuing that right now. We don't have firms in the States that are AMA approved. There are some in Europe, and they have alternate models, and the models are all quite different. And the one message we have heard from the regulators is, you're all holding too little capital, make it more. So ultimately, however sophisticated we become in our capital modeling, the regulators tend to have a number in their head that they're looking for us to aim for. So these numbers are very large, but then when you look at the types of operational risk events that have been suffered in the industry just in the last 12 months, you can understand why they're looking for those large numbers.
Someone else asked, I know that companies provide market risk to analysts and investors, but do they provide operational risks? And could you make your management of risk actually a selling point to investors and analysts?
Yes, absolutely. And
you know any company that you might point to that actually does a good job
that actually does it already?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, they're all going to have to do it, because the third pillar of Basel III is tell everybody how you calculated your capital and how you manage your risk. So people are going to become very transparent about how they manage their operational risk. The other thing is that rating agencies are already all over this. So when Moody's or S&P come in and decide on your credit rating, they look at your operational risk framework, and they measure it against standards that look very similar to Basel II standards. And that type, if you look at it, for the example of Société Générale, Société Générale had a downgrade in their credit rating. And the credit rating agency said at the time, this is because of poor operational risk management. We are downgrading them. Okay, so absolutely, your operational risk framework should be a selling point. And if you're looking to be a third-party vendor, by the way, for a large financial institution, they're going to want to see a robust operational risk framework. And as more and more people become educated in what good operational risk management looks like, they are going to expect to see it. And they want to see it in a mature way. It doesn't have to be highly complex, but it does need to be matured.
Great. This has been a great presentation. Alas, we are out of time. Philippa, I want to thank you so much for this discussion, and I want to thank Zurich for making it possible, and thank all of you for joining us today. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.